So we have now studied UX research or how to conduct a research by using different methods like interviews, surveys, usability studies, and etc. So what happens is when we conduct research, there are so many bias that occurs, and we need to overcome these biases, right? It's really important. Otherwise, it's going to affect your research, and you might not get desired results. So, what is a bias? Now, a bias means to favor something or have prejudice against something based on limited information. Like it's like making up your mind about someone before you've really gotten to know them. You already have a bad image of that person in your mind without actually getting to know that person, right? You're being impartial towards that person. So this is what is known as sorry, you're being partial towards that person, right? You might have heard of this term partiality, that the teacher is being partial, right? That means the teacher is favoring one student over another student. So this is what is bias. Now bias has different types. The first one is confirmation bias. Now confirmation bias occurs when you start looking for evidence to prove a hypothesis you have. Let's understand this using an example. Let's say you have a preconception that left-handed people are more creative than right-handed people. Now, because you think you already have the answer, you're drawn to information that confirms your beliefs and preconceptions, right? You'll always try to underestimate the facts that prove your contradiction wrong, right? So the points that or the facts that prove your preconception or your beliefs wrong, you are more likely to tend to ignore them, right? This is known as confirmation bias, that you constantly keep on looking for evidences that support your hypothesis or that are in favor of your hypothesis. So this is something you have to avoid while conducting research. So how can you overcome confirmation bias? Well, the some of the points are to actively listen to the user when you are interviewing them. Ask open-ended questions when conducting interviews. I've explained what an open-ended question is. Ask questions in such a way to which you can get a detailed response, right? Not something like, for example, if you ask your user that how would you rate your experience using the app on a scale of 1 to 10? Now to this question you'll get a very short answer because they're just going to tell a number like 9 or 8 or maybe 6 or 7. So this is close ended question where you get very detailed, sorry, where you get very limited information from your user. An open ended question is like, how would you describe your experience using the app? Now this is an open-ended question because to this you'll get a detailed response from your user. They'll tell every good or bad aspects about their experience. So this is what you have to ask. You have to ask open-ended questions and avoid close-ended questions when conducting interviews. Actively listen to them. You might also make notes while interviewing. Write down important points and include a large sample of users. Don't just interview 2 or 3 participants. Try to interview large sample of users. That will only help you. So this was confirmation bias. Then the second one is false consensus bias. Now, false consensus bias is assumption that others will think the same way as you do, right? You tend to think that whatever you are thinking is something the other person is also thinking. So in UX research, this happens when we overestimate the number of people who will agree with our idea, right? So you have to definitely avoid this bias also. And how would you do that? You can identify or articulate your own assumptions, actively listen to your users, ask open-ended questions, make notes of whatever the user is telling about his experience, and definitely survey large group of people. So this was about false consensus. Next is recency bias. Now recency bias, as the term suggests, recent. It's easiest to remember the last thing you've heard in an interview or in a conversation, right? So whatever topic you talked about at the end is you're more likely to remember that, right? So this is recency bias. You're only able to remember the recent conversation or the recent topic you talked about. So this is known as recency bias. And definitely you can take detailed notes, or you can also record the interview with your user, but of course you need to take permission for that from your interviewee or user, right? So definitely recording the entire interview is one of the best method. Then we have primacy bias. Now, primacy bias is where you remember the first participant most strongly, right? You only remember the first person or the first user you interviewed. This is known as primacy bias. Again, take detailed notes or maybe recordings, interview each participant in the same way. If you interview each participant in the same way, you're most likely to remember each and every participant. And if you're not able to do that, just take notes or maybe a recording. And you can just go through that recording after the interview. So this was primacy bias. Then last we have is sunk cost fallacy. Now, sunk cost fallacy means the deeper we get into a project we are interested in, the harder it is to change course, right? So this phrase sunk cost, this phrase refers to the time we have already spent or sunk into a project, right? So let's understand this as an example. For example, you might think to yourself that you might as well keep watching this terrible movie because I've already watched half of it already. This might have happened a lot of times, right? You might be watching a movie and you felt it wasn't so good, but since you're already halfway, you decide to watch the entire movie. So this is what is sunk cost fallacy, right? You might have invested hours into designing a new feature, but then learn that the feature doesn't really address the user problem, but you still keep on working on that feature, although you know that it doesn't work properly or it doesn't really address the user problem. So this is what is sunk cost fallacy, and you definitely need to avoid this. How do you overcome this? Break down your project into smaller phases, right? Try to achieve those small milestones and outline points where you can decide whether to continue or stop, right? So this will help in overcoming the bias. Yeah, so this was about bias and its types. So now we have understood UX research, how to conduct research, and what are the biases that we need to take care of while conducting user interviews. Now, after you are done with your interviews, collecting all the information about the user, you have to now categorize, or you have to make a chart where it a type of a easily understood chart that explains everything designers have learned about a type of user, right? We have conducted so many interviews, so we have each and every information about the user. So what that chart should contain, the chart should contain what the user says, what the user thinks, what the user does, and how does the user feels, right? So we can create such a chart in order to understand our user even more properly, because if we categorize something, if we categorize something in different points or different categories, then we can easily understand that particular thing, right? So that is what exactly we're doing here. We're categorizing it, or we are splitting it into different categories, right? Now, after you have created this type of chart where you can get to know your user even more clearly by finishing off all the interviews, now you have to understand the pain points of the user. Now, what does pain point means? Pain point is the problem or problem faced by the user, right? Let me just show you an example. So this is an example of UX design, or you can say a project. Yeah. So here what is the story of this project, that we've created a checklist app for wedding ceremonies, and it provides the checklist of all the common ceremonies that are performed in India. So after researching users, these were the pain points, right? The diversity is because when a wedding is conducted, there are so many different ceremonies. You go to a different part of country and you'll find one more ceremony. That's what this diversity means. Was one of the pain point, like budget, food, hospitality. You need to be hospitable to your guests, right? So these were the pain points. So this is how you identify what all problems the user is facing, and that's what is pain point. Now pain point can be of different categories. It could be financial, right? Like we just saw budget, right? Budget was a pain point, so it could be a financial pain point. Second is product pain point. Now product pain point means quality issues related to your product, right? For example, Norman doors. Norman doors are such doors where you can't tell whether to push or pull the door in order to open it. So that is a product pain point, because there are some issues or there are quality issues related to the product. Then third is process. Process means that there are frustrations that could stop a user from going from point A to point B. Suppose your product is a website. Now the user wants to check the dashboard, but he isn't able to locate the dashboard. So that means he is facing problems, or there are frustrations that are stopping the user from going from point A to point B. So this is known as process. Pain points that occur during the process, or during the process where the user is completing its task, or user is unable to complete its task. This all comes into the category of process pain point. Then last is support. Support is that when users interact with your product, they might have a lot of questions, and if they can't find answers to their questions, they won't feel fully supported, right? So this is known as support. You should always have like customer care support we have for each and every product. So if you won't have that, the customer won't feel supported, right? The questions of the customer won't be answered, or a user. So this is the support pain point.